I'm thrilled to kick off our afternoon of lectures. We have 3 additional that we'll have together. And the first up this afternoon is Allison Donoghue, who has her master's in decorative arts and material culture from the Bard Graduate Center. And Allison is just wrapping up her year as the Tiffany intern at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And she is the William C. and Susan S. Mariner Fellowship for the Emerging Museum Professional, which is sponsored through our friends at the Decorative Arts Trust. And we are grateful for their continued support of this program through this fellowship. Allison will be giving the lecture, Approbation in the Highest Degree, Awards of Merit, Advertisement, and Mrs. Isabella Graham Smith's Female Academy, 1829 to 1832. And after Allison, we will have Tessa Payer, Assistant Curator of Textiles and Historic Dress for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And Tessa is the inaugural Carol Holcomb Fellowship recipient. And many of you guys may have heard her give a lecture recently at Antiques Forum. And when we were at Williamsburg, we actually kind of roped her into showing off some of their treasures along with Neil Hurst. So, all righty, welcome up Allison. Oh, before I do, Tessa's lecture, will be Like Mother, Like Daughter, Identity and Needlework Across 2 Generations. All right, Allison, your turn.
Thank you, Leah, for that wonderful introduction. In 1830, 11-year-old Frances Chapman received an award for having merited the approbation of her teachers at Mrs. Isabella Smith's Female Academy in Georgetown, today a part of DC. The award was entirely hand-decorated, meticulously rendered in ink and watercolor on thick Bristol board paper imported from England. The heading announces Frances's name and her school in large, bold script that subtly frames intersecting circles of bluebells. Within the circles, written in perfect cursive, was a poem by James Gates Percival. The poem, extolling the sweetness and brevity of childhood, was paraphrased and tailored for Frances. While Percival's original verse laments the author's inability to return to those innocent hours, the award highlights Frances's current moment of childhood and was further personalized with endearments of sweet girl and the use of her nickname, Fanny. The flowers themselves may have been chosen for their meaning. In the 19th century, bluebells were associated with the idea of constancy. Perhaps Smith was imparting Chapman to be faithful and dependable in her work. These circles form a kind of Venn diagram where the place and time Chapman earned her award, Georgetown, 1830, unites the 2 halves. This merit award may have been presented to Frances at one of the reviews held by Mrs. Smith's Academy to demonstrate the students' progress each fortnight. Perhaps the verse was read aloud to an audience of students and parents, or alternatively, handed to Frances directly for her private enjoyment. The award was valued by Frances, passed down through her descendants, and eventually gifted to Mesda, along with a large archive of family objects. Possibly decorated by Mrs. Smith herself or one of her daughters who assisted in her teaching, the carefully hand-wrought designs demonstrated mastery of the refined skills Smith advertised to teach the young ladies that attended her school. Frances's parents, Major Henry and Mary Davidson Chapman, likely learned of the Academy through one of the hundreds of advertisements Smith posted in local DC newspapers between 1829 and 1832. However, this award is not only a piece of sentimental familial ephemera. It was carefully crafted and presented by Smith with intention. The meticulous hand-drawn designs were tangible proof of Smith's skills in painting, drawing, penmanship, and English, as well as her ability to teach those subjects to her students. Read alongside her advertisements, I will consider how Smith deployed the award to attract students and promote her school in the competitive DC landscape. Isabella Graham Smith came from a line of successful female teachers. Her mother, Isabella Marshall Graham, was a famed teacher and philanthropist. As a child, Graham attended a finishing school in Scotland. She would come to rely on this education to support herself and her children when she was widowed at the age of 33. After the death of her husband, she founded several finishing schools for girls in Scotland and later in the United States. Her early experience of widowhood spurred her to establish the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children in 1797, along with Elizabeth Ann Seton, Elizabeth Hamilton, and her middle daughter, Joanna Bethune. In a period when most philanthropic societies were run by men, Graham's work in teaching and charity was revolutionary. She published letters and opinions on behalf of herself and the society she represented in New York newspapers, including the Evening Post. Graham was a household name by the time she died in 1814. Her daughters, Joanna Graham Bethune and Isabella Graham Smith, both went into teaching. Joanna founded the Orphan Asylum in 1808 and later the Infant School Society in 1827. She too used print media to share her beliefs, publishing several books on her teaching pedagogy. Isabel taught in her mother's boarding school in New York until it closed in 1797. She used her experience there to establish her own schools, first within her home at 9 Murray Street in New York and later in Georgetown. Oftentimes operated out of a home, finishing schools taught young women every branch of education, both useful and ornamental. Girls learned reading, writing, and different methods of decorative needlework like embroidery. Other subjects, including sciences, French, music, dancing, drawing, and painting, were also commonly offered. Isabella Smith moved south to Georgetown in 1828, where she sought to establish a boarding school similar to those she had run in New York. Smith used print advertisement to promote herself and her female academy. Between 1829 and 1832, Smith published an astounding 354 advertisements in local newspapers, including the Daily National Intelligencer and Washington Express and the United States Telegraph. She may have invested so significantly in newspaper advertisement due to their increase in popularity in this period. The number of newspapers published in the United States exponentially increased during the early 19th century, going from 200 published in 1800 to nearly 3,000 published in 1860. Many of these newspapers cost as little as a penny, allowing them to circulate to a much wider audience. It was important for Smith to distinguish herself and her female academy from the other girls' schools in Georgetown and Washington City at the time. Georgetown already had several finishing schools for the wealthy inhabitants of the city when Mrs. Smith arrived. The Young Ladies' Academy of Georgetown, sometimes called the Georgetown Visitation, was established in 1799 for the daughters of affluent Roman Catholic families. Lydia English's established her school, known as the Female Seminary, in 1826. The Female Seminary was open to girls of any faith and remained in operation until 1861. Aside from the larger boarding schools, smaller day schools were also operated out of homes. Her first known advertisement in Georgetown offers insight into how Smith attempted to distinguish herself and her academy. Her first strategy involved invoking her significant familial and pedagogical heritage. The announcement, published in the Daily National Intelligencer and Washington Express on August 13, 1829, states, "It will be Mrs. Smith's endeavor to imitate the plans and principles laid down by her late respected mother, Mrs. Isabel Graham, of the city of New York, in a similar establishment conducted by her there for many years, in which Mrs. Smith assisted until its close." Smith likely hoped that her mother's work in education and celebrity status would inspire trust in her potential patrons. Furthermore, Smith emphasized her own role working at her mother's school. She had insisted until its close, presumably gaining considerable experience working with young ladies and learning from her mother. Smith's advertisements also took care to emphasize the other well-trained teachers she took special lengths to bring to her school. On September 25, 1829, she took out an ad in the United States Telegraph to inform her friends and the public about her return from the North with 2 ladies of first-rate talent. A subsequent posting revealed that she had gone to Philadelphia, New York, and Troy to find the appropriate teachers and assistants for her seminary. Aside from the quality of instruction, Smith promised in her advertisements, she also highlighted the accommodations her students and boarders would receive. She described the school as a large and commodious house that was surpassed by none on the district for pure air, fine water, and every accommodation suitable for such an institution. Health and sanitation were serious concerns in DC at the time. The Tiber Creek, a tributary of the Potomac River, was fetid and full of waste, likely causing disease in the city. By emphasizing the pure air and fine water, Smith reassured her potential clients that her school was safe and healthful. These advertisements also give insight into the other promotional efforts Smith made. At the end of each ad she published, Smith invited parents and guardians to the examinations of her pupils in order that they may have frequent opportunities of judging student improvement. Smith was not alone in this strategy. Other instructors teaching in Georgetown and Washington City also publicized examinations and demonstrations to show student work. While it's unclear exactly how students participated in these reviews, if there were oral examinations, concerts, recitals in music or dancing, display of needlework, or simple classroom observation, these reviews were consistent. Smith scheduled them every fortnight. While not as direct as a newspaper advertisement, these public reviews gave Smith the opportunity to present the success of her students and, through them, her teaching abilities. Parents did not need to question what their daughters were learning in her school. They could attend a review and judge for themselves. There are many surviving examples of merit awards from schools across the country dating to the 19th century. Awards were decorated in a variety of styles and colors, including flowers, patriotic messages, and examples of good behavior. Merit awards decorated with colorful floral and fauna designs were commonly given to girls. Students received awards for good behavior, successful academic performance, penmanship, and increasingly in the 19th century, for school attendance. This example from Miss Lydia English's school celebrated Julia Ann Wilmore Fowler's presence for roll call 120 times. As evidence of a student's good performance in school, they were invested with significant personal value and consequently often saved by families, making their way into the collections of museums and historical societies. Isabella Chapman's Merit Award is unique because it's the only surviving example of an award from Smith's school. It is also an example of the hand-decorated and personalized merit awards that were popular between 1810 and 1840. These other examples from Lydia English's school date to 1848. As new color printing techniques like chromolithography became popular around the mid-19th century, mass-produced awards became more common. While hand-decorated, personalized awards celebrated the academic achievements of students, they also demonstrated a teacher's skill in painting, drawing, penmanship, and English. In her book, Rewards of Merit, Tokens of a Child's Progress and a Teacher's Esteem as an Enduring Aspect of American Religious and Secular Education, Patricia Fenn argues that expertly creating and executing original designs was a professional skill for teachers. A handmade award demonstrated a teacher was qualified to instruct older students in the skills of drawing and painting. I would like for a moment to return to looking closely at Frances Chapman's award. Notice the 3 distinct scripts she's used in the heading, each meticulously perfected. Look at the elegant calligraphy within the 2 overlapping circles of bluebells, the flowers themselves possibly imparting a deeper symbolic meaning. The verse was thoughtfully and creatively personalized for Frances specifically. This award would have taken considerable time, creativity, and skill to complete. When compared with the mass-produced awards made only a few decades later, often a simple certificate with a blank space where a teacher could fill in a student's name, the incredible artistry and quality of Chapman's award is evident. As an embodiment of the lessons that girls would have been expected to learn at Smith's Academy, Chapman's Merit Award was tangible proof of Smith's skills in these subjects. When it was shown to parents or displayed in the home, Smith's name and school clearly visible on the top of the page, the award became a part of Smith's advertising campaign. In the same way, she invited parents and guardians to observe student learning and consequently her skill in instruction, At the fortnightly reviews, the merit awards ultimately contributed to Smith's promotional strategy. Smith was successful in establishing her school in Georgetown, being described as the principal of a highly respectable female seminary in an article in the spring of 1830. However, that same year, an unfortunate accident threw her school and her family into upheaval. Mrs. Smith and her husband were in a violent gig or carriage accident. Both were thrown from the carriage, resulting in serious injury. According to a report in the Daily National Intelligencer and Washington Express, the upper part of Mrs. Smith's face was severely cut so that she will lose the use of her left eye. She may have also sustained internal injuries. One of Mr. Smith's limbs was severely injured, impeding his mobility and preventing him from easily traveling between Georgetown and Washington City, where he worked as a clerk for the Treasury. Only a month later, on July 13th, Mrs. Smith announced that she would move her school to Washington. This was a difficult decision. In her public statement in the United States Telegraph, she wrote that it was at great sacrifice to Mrs. Smith's feelings, breaking up a most interesting establishment and leaving behind her a number of truly amiable and highly promising students to whom she and her daughters had become warmly attached. Despite the injuries and the move, Smith attempted to reestablish her school in Washington City. Her advertisements shifted in this period. Not only did they clearly list the subjects she offered with the cost of each class per quarter, her ads had a new emphasis on the higher branches of education. In March of 1831, she announced her recruitment of a respected male teacher, Mr. Ruggles, to instruct the ladies in philosophy, chemistry, astronomy, rhetoric, logic, and mathematics. She further attempted to gain a foothold in Washington City by purchasing apparatus for the illustration of geometry and astronomy. It was evident that she continued to offer training in the ornamental arts as well. In 1832, in a possible bid to attract nurse students, she advertised ornamental painting classes open to all young ladies, not only her regular pupils. She continued to hold reviews of her students' work in this period and could have potentially been making merit awards as well. However, despite her efforts, her new school did not last. The final record mentioning the institution was in an advertisement published in 1832. Smith herself faded from public record as well. Nearly 20 years later, an 1850 census found Mrs. Smith and her husband living in a boarding house. Her husband, Andrew, was still working as a clerk, a position he had held since they moved to D.C. in 1828. But no occupation was listed for Isabella. Later that same year, the Smiths returned to Scotland, where Isabella died 10 years later in 1860. While Mrs. Smith's Female Academy may have only operated for a short time, she and her teachers had a lasting impact on her students. The Merit Award came to Mesda with a large archive of items related to Francis Chapman's life. Two of my favorite pieces from this collection are a gold-plated mechanical pencil personalized with Francis's maiden name and a valentine decorated with verse written in careful penmanship and complemented by a rose meticulously painted in watercolor and ink. To me, these personal items are indicative of the skills Chapman learned from Mrs. Smith's school and ultimately the longer legacy of her program. The award captures both the momentary overlap in the lives of these women, as well as the continued connection Chapman and Smith, and more broadly Smith's mother, Isabella Graham, made through their education. To conclude, I would like to thank Leah Lane, Johanna Brown, Dr. Torrin Gadsden, Dr. Stephanie Kosak, Melissa Bertram, Jessie Harris, Jenny Garwood, Kim Wilson-May, and my fellow Mesda Fellows. This presentation would not have been possible without your enthusiastic support throughout my research and writing process. Finally, I would like to thank William C. and Susan S. Mariner and the Decorative Arts Trust, whose generous support funded the Fellowship for Emerging Museum Professionals. Thank you.
Hello. Before I start, I just want to briefly give a huge thank you to Mesda for the opportunity to be a summer fellow and to pursue this research, and to Carol Holcomb for so generously supporting my textile pursuits this June. And without further ado, I will get into the results of said pursuits. It was late in October when Maryland resident Mary Elizabeth Eleanor Beale finished stitching her sampler. It had been quite a process. She began with the border, working a zigzagging green vine dotted with rosy red berries onto a plain ground. 3 full alphabets came next, alternating vibrant colors of wool embroidery thread every 2 letters. She didn't limit herself to one stitch, switching between cross-stitch, straight stitch, and even distinctive eyelet stitches as she worked a smaller scale, a large scale, and a cursive alphabet. Mary, who went by Molly, was not perfect. She stitched one of her J's in the wrong direction, and she fell victim to that common, wrote the initial letters too big and now you have to cram the rest in, letting her cursive N spill out over the border. After a religious verse from Ecclesiastes 12, Molly proudly took ownership of her work, signing it with her name, her home, and the date in blue thread. Molly E. Beale, Woodlawn, October 26th. Now, what I found most intriguing when I first looked at Molly's needlework here at Mesda was the date she stitched after her last alphabet. Whether through her own crooked stitches or later nibbling by pests, it's somewhat illegible. 1861, 1867, 1857. Whether the 1850s or 60s, though, this is outside what I would typically consider the sampler making period. Needlework historian Betty Ring ends her book Girlhood Embroidery in 1850, while Gloria Seaman Allen notes the presence of later samplers in A Maryland Sampling, but ends her own study in 1860. Even contemporary viewers thought of samplers as a past art. In August 1865, a San Francisco reporter who saw a sampler at a local fair commented, "It is no unpleasing reminder of bygone days to look at it, and recall the times when we were taught to walk in the ways of virtue and stitch samplers." Why, then, was Molly Beale making an alphabet sampler in the middle of the 1800s? Now, Molly was not the first needleworker in her family. In the 1830s, her mother, Mary Ann Magruder, stitched her own sampler, which was recently donated to Mesda along with Molly's. On first glance, it's a bit hard to find commonalities. The silk embroidery threads on Mary Ann's sampler haven't held their color as well as Molly's wool, giving it a muted appearance. Mary Ann's is rather square, Molly's is rectangular. But with some close looking, the similarities in design become apparent. The budding border is similar. The verse, though common amongst girls' samplers, is the same. "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." Molly borrowed her 3 alphabets from her mother's lettering, from the eyelet stitch on the largest letters, down to the way they shape their X's in cursive. And mother and daughter shared some stitching troubles. Mary Ann has a flipped S, just like Molly's J. But the structure of their signatures has the same proud format: name, location, date. Molly E. Beale, Woodlawn, October 26th. Mary Ann Magruder, Mount Lubentia, May 1836. So what drove Molly Beale to not only stitch a fiber arts form from a bygone era, but to copy the design from her own mother's work? Samplers have always been a statement of identity, in that they are usually signed, but I believe Molly's statement goes beyond simply her signature. Her choice of design and form was a deliberate one, a way to create her own image in the model of a lineage of genteel female needleworkers like her mother. However, this was a complicated image. Molly's use of materials displays that the practice of fiber arts had undergone a great change in the mid-19th century. Her design may have been intended to communicate a stable line of Southern femininity, but that belies her mother's complicated childhood and Molly's own experience of a turbulent national era that ended in civil war. To understand this statement of identity, we start with the basics. Who was Molly Beale, and what lineage was she trying to connect to? Molly Beale, born in Prince George's County, Maryland in 1842, was the eldest child of Washington Jeremiah Beale and Mary Ann Magruder. The Beale and Magruder families had intertwined histories in Prince George's County as white planters who claimed colonial patents in the 1680s and had built their fortunes through tobacco plantations and enslaved labor in the decades following. Marian Magruder, Molly's mother, probably grew up at the plantation she stitched onto her own sampler, Mount Lubentia. Her father, Dennis Magruder, was given the property by his father in 1779 and took a fire on site as an opportunity to redesign the residence in the latest fashion. In 1798, the two-story brick house, along with an adjoining passage, kitchen, and outbuildings, was one of the highest valued amongst its neighbors. Marianne's home was filled with a number of fine furnishings, as listed on her father's estate inventory in 1836. Carpeting, 7 bedsteads, 4 covered with Marseille quilts, and mahogany furniture. The Magruders were prepared for upscale entertaining. Besides tea and coffee pots, they had cut glass decanters, jelly glasses, fruit dishes, and a backgammon box for after-dinner gaming. Pushing aside the damask window curtains revealed a landscape of 600 surrounding acres, which produced tobacco and wheat. Dennis's estate inventory also reveals the names of those behind the enormous acreage and decorative furniture. 33 enslaved African Americans forcibly labored at Mount Lubentia. Jenny, Nat, Beck, and Ben were the eldest of the enslaved community in their 70s. The youngest was Hannah's infant daughter, still a baby when Dennis Magruder died in 1836. Marianne may not have thought of these men, women, and children when she stitched Mount Lubentia onto her sampler, but it was the use of their lives on the plantation that underpinned the Magruder family's status as white Southern elites. But in the 1830s, that landed status was growing unstable. Marianne was the daughter of Dennis's fourth wife, Marianne Beard, and she was the youngest of a group of Magruder children, each with their own claims on the property. In 1832, Dennis deeded Mount Lubentia to Marianne's elder half-brother, Dennis Jr. Though Marianne, mother and daughter, were granted life tenancy, Dennis Jr. moved quickly to use the property to offset debts that he'd racked up. Further property disputes took place after Dennis Sr.'s death in 1836, and in 1839, the elder Marianne deeded her interest in the Magruder property in Prince George's County, including Mount Lubentia, to neighbor Otho Berry Beale, and reportedly moved to Washington, D.C. Despite this uncertainty, and perhaps because of it, Marianne Beard cultivated a persona of feminine accomplishment for her daughter. Only a few months after Dennis Sr.'s death, she was on the lookout for a governess, a young lady who was competent to give instruction in the various branches of an English education, music, and drawing. The younger Marianne was eventually enrolled in the female seminary at Georgetown. Founded by Lydia Scudder English in 1826, the school became a well-known educational institution. The seminary's students were the cream of the crop in terms of elite white families, largely Southern, daughters whose education was paid for through enslaved labor on plantations. At the seminary, Marianne could expect a well-rounded education with courses in algebra, geometry, history, geography, natural philosophy, grammar, writing, and elocution, alongside languages, fine arts, and music. Needlework, too, was a large part of the curriculum. Since the mid-17th century, needlework, notably sampler making, had been a key part of women's education. In this pre-sewing machine era, hand sewing skills were nearly universal amongst women, whether for practically mending and making clothes or for decorative pursuits. For young women whose families could afford to provide them with dedicated schooling, needlework training was expected. In a catalog published by the seminary for the upcoming 1834 to 35 school year, Lydia English even noted, "Some of the parents, having expressed an opinion that sufficient attention has not been bestowed upon needlework, we have now engaged a lady to give special attention to what is indeed an important branch of female education." Samplers and needlework pictures like Marianne's were part of the learning process, final projects that displayed mastery of a variety of stitches and techniques. But they were also status symbols, often worked in silk embroidery threads and intended for display in parlors and public spaces. So Marianne's work was intended to represent her identity as a respectable young woman. But silk thread could only cover so many sins. Did Marianne know that her half-brother was using the property to recoup funds, even as she was creating a physical reminder of her ties to the plantation? Did she work this sampler in Mount Lubentia, or was it completed while she was living in Georgetown, after her mother deeded the property to the Beals? And what of the enslaved men, women, and children whose labor underpinned Marianne's statement of white female gentility? In 1840, Marianne married Washington Jeremiah Beal, son of the Otho who had been deeded Mount Lubentia. Needlework was evidently an important aspect of femininity for the Magruder women, enough that Marianne's younger daughter Rosalie knew to highlight it in her retelling of the wedding, describing how Marianne wore a lovely handkerchief of the finest linen cambric and thread lace, which was handmade and presented by Mrs. Captain William C. Beard, and stockings of exquisite raw silk, marked with the bride's name in full in one thread in needlework by her mother. After the wedding, the couple moved onto a plantation called Woodlawn, where Molly was likely born in 1842. In 1853, they had an updated residence built on the property, a large Greek Revival-style house. Like Mount Lubentia, it was a built embodiment of the Beal family's wealth. In 1850, Washington's parents, Otho Beal and Mary Berry, whose portraits are now here at Mesda, had accumulated real estate valued over $70,000, and the federal slave schedule notes that they enslaved at least 74 men, women, and children. Washington himself would later be described as one of the most energetic and liberal as well as wealthiest planters in Prince George's County. In 1860, a year before this county map was made, his real estate was valued at around $91,000, personal at over $92,000, and included at least 20 enslaved people, ranging in age from a year old to 74. With this wealth, Marianne Magruder pursued a structured education for her daughters, Molly and her younger sister Rosalie, and sent them to the Patapsco Female Institute in Ellicott City in neighboring Howard County. Patapsco, founded in 1835, was the brainchild of a group of elite Marylanders seeking a formal and Southern-based education for their daughters, and the expensive tuition, about $290 a year, largely defined the status of the students. Surprisingly, the school's most famous principal, Almira Phelps, was hired for her Northern background. She'd apprenticed at the Troy Female Seminary in upstate New York and taught at several Connecticut schools. But amidst rising sectional conflict, she was quick to reassure parents that Patapsco was a Southern school. The Academy's 1852-53 catalog described a Northern school in all its essential features and characteristics, but divested of all that might be offensive to Southern feelings, is planted in a Southern clime, and where the peculiar domestic institution of the South exists. Patapsco students like Molly and Rosalie had a strict schedule, and like their mother's experience in Georgetown, a broad academic experience. Washington Beal's 1860 account with Patapsco, specifically for Rosalie's attendance, includes a printed list of the set curriculum. While Washington didn't pay for each of these aspects, the subjects still give a sense of what was available to Patapsco's female students. French, English, literary, and scientific branches, which included chemical lectures and botanical excursions. Music, piano, guitar, harp, singing, and dancing. And fine art, watercolor, and oil painting. But needlework is notably missing from Patapsco's curriculum. And that's not to say it wasn't happening on site. Principal Phelps notes in the school's 8th annual report, dated 1848, certain portions of time are appropriated for ornamental needlework, plain sewing, and necessary repairs of clothing. But in my research, I wasn't able to find a sampler or a needlework picture distinctly tied to a maker who worked it at Patapsco. And I invite you to please show me one, if you have one out there, because I would love to see it. When the Beal sisters attended Patapsco in the 1860s, needlework was no longer at the forefront of a woman's education. Now, that isn't to say that in the 18th century, women only learned needlework and suddenly the 19th century brought academics. There were women's schools in the 18th century, like the Moravian seminaries in Bethlehem and Salem, that were well ahead of the curve in terms of women's academic education. I'd argue this was more of a tipping of the scales, as needlework shifted from a primary subject to an extracurricular. But Molly's sampler clearly shows that, despite this shift, women didn't stop learning needlework. The rise of published patterns and guides filled this educational gap. As early as 1795, German printers were producing needlework manuals and patterns, a trend that caught on in France, England, and the US by the 1830s. Godey's Ladies' Book, a woman's magazine first published in 1830, started a ladies' work department in 1846, including patterns and instructions to allow women, in their words, to take up these new kinds of needlework without a teacher. And one of these new kinds of needlework was Berlin wool work, a type of canvas work defined by the use of counted stitches like cross-stitch, the use of brightly colored German wool, the covering of a ground fabric with embroidery thread, and the use of patterns printed on point paper. Now, Molly's sampler is not exactly Berlin wool work, not in the traditional sense, but it definitely shows the impact of the practice. The brightly dyed wool thread she used, which has held its color far better than her mother's silk, as seen from the back here, can probably be traced back to German wool processing. Of course, there's a level of irony in that Molly was inspired by a contemporary practice that democratized needlework education. Cheaper materials and accessible patterns and guides meant that women across the economic spectrum were making woolwork pieces. But Molly didn't make a patterned project that anyone with a subscription to Godey's could. She made a modernized version of her mother's 1830s sampler, something her mother likely learned from a needlework teacher. Molly then connected herself with a heritage of Southern feminine gentility communicated through needlework. Magruder and Beale women had been using needlework to make this statement before, from Mary Ann's sampler to Rosalie's textile-focused description of Mary Ann's wedding. Needlework was a venue for the women of this family line to express their wealth and status. But Molly stitched at a period when this specific brand of wealth and status was teetering. Whether her sampler reads 1857 or 1861, her status as the daughter of a wealthy Maryland planter was highly contested as the United States approached the Civil War. Though Maryland ultimately didn't secede from the Union, slaveholders like Molly's family had a clear bias towards preserving the institution of slavery. In 1861, her father and other white residents of Upper Marlboro adopted resolutions restricting the movement of enslaved people in the area and started organizing a home guard. The Beales had social and political ties to the Confederacy. Molly's father received this cup as an honorary member of the National Rifles, a DC militia unit that he hosted at Woodlawn for a 4th of July party in 1860. Their latest captain, F.B. Schaefer, notably refused to take an oath of loyalty to the Union after the start of the Civil War, instead joining the Confederacy and raising a company of secessionist-leaning Maryland and D.C. residents. Molly's specific persona as a genteel Southern woman was soon under fire. With men off fighting, women were called on to support the war effort, often in ways that directly challenged Southern white feminine standards. Georgia resident Lila Chun wrote in 1862, "Ladies keep the stores here now, their husbands having joined the army. It looks funny in Dixie to see a lady behind the counter." When the call went out for patriotic women to make homespun, white slave-owning women found themselves in an ideological bind. Typically, spinning and weaving were tasks assigned to enslaved women, leaving fancy work to white women. White Southern identity and Southern patriotism now found themselves at odds. Southern women's schools were often repurposed or investigated during the war. The female seminary at Georgetown, as seen on the screen, became a hospital. In the fall of 1862, the 12th New Jersey Volunteers, a Union infantry unit, camped in Ellicott City, where Patapsco was located. In his diary, Lieutenant Colonel Richard S. Thompson noted the October day when Union troops searched the Female Institute for arms. The material representations of Molly's Southern feminine identity, her sampler, her family's plantations, survived the Civil War. and she and her sister Rosalie positioned themselves as the keepers of the family heritage. Their father sold Mount Lubentia to Rosalie's husband in 1883. Woodlawn was purchased by Molly and her siblings in 1892. In these homes, Molly and her sister gathered items that spoke to their lineage. Molly and Mary Ann's samplers, family furniture, school certificates, as Allison just discussed. Even a needlework picture on paper made by their paternal grandmother, Mary Berry, items that, in a final act of lineage preservation, were recently donated to Mesda's collection. Now, in the context of a museum collection, what image does this sampler project? It's an outlier, an example of a form that invites us to consider how needlework education and practice changed over time. It's a link between a mother and daughter and a line of women joined by their skill with a needle. And it is the story of a young woman deliberately crafting an image of herself beyond simply the stitching of her name. Thank you.